Hello, my name is Dorian Kyles, and I will be presenting information on Chicago's Toxic Donut. This case actually took place in my hometown. I am originally from Chicago, Illinois, and I thought it was very interesting that I came across a topic that I never ever knew anything about, and the name in itself just really interested me. So that's what prompted me to go forth in researching the topic more. So here's a little bit of a backstory on this particular case. So it was located in the project area of Chicago South Side called Alchett Gardens, and it was originally for African American veterans during World War II. So basically, Alchett Gardens was also known as the Toxic Donut that housed blacks in nearly 1,600 units in the community of Riverdale, which sat right in the middle of brownfields, Superfund sites, and landfills. Alchett Gardens was labeled the highest concentration of toxic waste sites in the nation. There are two levels of conflict identified in this case, which were waste management and landfills. The community was actually surrounded by 50 landfills and 382 industrial facilities. There were 250 leaking storage tanks, and toxic studies conducted in Alchett Gardens since the 1980s have exposed dangerous amounts of mercury, lead, DDT, PCBs, PAHs, heavy metals, and xylene. I thought this was completely just unfathomable. Over the span of 68 years, there have been 6,400 residents affected by the toxic donut. From research, this conflict started in 1945, and there have been several government actors, including the Chicago Housing Authority, the Chicago Department of Public Health, Illinois Department of Public Health, and EPA. There are also environmental justice organizations in support of this movement, such as People for Community Recovery and Greenpeace. Also, street protesters and visible mobilization groups like the local A-holes, neighborly citizens, women, and the racially discriminated all came together alike. Various forms of mobilization included blockades, public campaigns, street protests and marches, complaints letters, and petitions. Pollutants surrounding the row houses involve noise pollution, soil contamination, groundwater pollution or depletion, air pollution, loss of landscape, and aesthetic degradation. And moreover, health impact caused environmental related diseases from exposure to unknown complex risk, for example, radiation. There was a lot of displacement at this time due to the social and political strains that was happening in this particular community. A lot of tenants of Alchett Gardens were displaced due to the impact of the social economy in Chicago. Currently, the Chicago Toxic Donut Project is still in operation. Here is just a photo of the Alchett Garden row houses in Chicago South Side. There you go. And I just wanted to touch on the significance of this particular case. Right here, we're just looking at blatant environmental racism here. In simple terms, it is the disproportionate burden of environmental hazards placed on people of color. This actually involved oppression through policies and practices that effectively placed low income and communities of color in close proximity near polluting factories. Again, these involved the power stations, plastic plants, methane gas, pipelines to infrastructure like major highways. As I did a bit of research on the activists in Chicago, I came across an interview of Chicago attorney Nicole Wood of the Environmental Protection Agency, and her response to environmental racism was this: I think the unfair treatment of people based on race, color, national origin, or income in respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulation, and policies. This lack of fair treatment was evident in the lack of access to clean air, water, and land in lower income areas and in areas that are not predominantly white. Another environmental racism rears its ugly head in denying certain groups of people an opportunity for meaningful participation and cleanup action in their communities. Also asked during the interview was specific, what were examples of environmental racism that were seen and what was being done about it? And Nicole's response was, many of the lower income neighborhoods in Chicago were established and developed around lead smelter sites, foundries, and power plants. This was due in part to the low income workers that wanted to live close by their jobs. Unfortunately, there were lasting negative health effects due to living and working in those facilities. The community had the highest rates of cancer in the city, along with elevated rates of other illnesses related to exposure to toxic substances. So here's where the politics get involved. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency began finding elevated levels of PAHs, pesticides, and heavy metals in the soil near Outstead Gardens in the 1990s. Residents began fighting to clean up these sites, and the EPA started providing technical assistance to local groups working to remedy. In early March of 2017, President Trump proposed his skinny budget, which would cut the EPA's funding and eliminating 3,000 jobs. At one point, Trump administration were looking to shut down the EPA's regional offices in Chicago. Environmental activist and executive director of People Community Recovery, Cheryl Johnson, says President Trump is taking her community back to days when it had no voice in the EPA. Residents in Outstead Gardens don't have the same political connections as people who are wealthier, nor do they have as much influence over where local governments allow hazardous materials. There was one particular activist that I had read about in particular. Her name was Cheryl Johnson, also giving light to her mother, Hazel Johnson, who was a very instrumental figure during the 60s and 70s for environmental rights. She basically worked endlessly, diligently to raise the voices of the poor people during that time. And here is a actual picture of, this is actual memorial. This is Cheryl Johnson and her family, and they are standing in front of Hazel Johnson, which is Cheryl Johnson's mom. They're at a memorial event for her, basically in recognition of all the work that her mom had done for the environment in Chicago. I also have just a couple of more pictures I meant to show at the very beginning. And this is just a picture of the landfills and brownfields that surrounded the Outstead row houses, the projects. People were actually surrounded by this gunk and this toxicity that caused so many health issues and struggles for a lot of the minority people. And here's just a picture of some of the industrial factories that surrounded the projects as well. Okay. And I like to show another picture. Here are protesters during the 60s and 70s that also took part in the environmental justice movement for the Chicago's Toxic Donut. So, what I will say as far as the most surprising experience for me is, one, the fact that I've lived in Chicago all of my life and never had I heard about the Chicago Toxic Donut. I literally grew up on the south side of Chicago, and this particular location in Riverdale is literally about 15, maybe 20 minutes away from where I actually grew up. So that really hit home because that was so close to where I lived, and I had no idea, what was actually going on. And it just makes me think how many other individuals out there are kind of in the same position where they weren't aware, they weren't informed. Was this issue pertinent and important enough for people to hear it everywhere, for the word to be exposed? Because this is the very first time I've ever came across this subject, this issue that occurred in my hometown. And this was a very, very devastating situation that a lot of minorities had struggled through for years. And still to this day, they are working on the project as we speak, trying to figure out strategies to decrease the landfills and the waste and toxicities that are damaging the environment and the people that are living in it as well, in the community as well. I think a disappointing point was Trump. At this time where people are dealing with harsh situation, it's very shocking that the government would decide to cause a rift instead of a resolution. At this time, why would you want to cut jobs? Why wouldn't we implement resolutions to make the environment better, to give people their rights back instead of taking from people? So I just really thought that was a very disappointing fact. Well, that definitely concludes my presentation, and I hope you all enjoyed. Thank you.